You were not invited here. Her own husband said it to her face in front of every powerful man in Virginia, and the room laughed. Clara Whitfield had gone 3 nights without sleep to save 11 families from ruin, and he threw her from his dining room like a servant who'd forgotten her place. She did not weep. She set her papers down, walked into the dark, and by first light she was gone, and so was the one contract that gave him everything he owned. If you think a quiet woman is a weak woman, stay with me to the end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. Forgive the hour, gentlemen. Clara Whitfield Ashford held the leather portfolio against her chest with both arms and made her voice carry over the laughter. I have papers that cannot wait until morning. The Western lots. The Western lots. Edmund Pike got there before her husband could. He tipped his chair back and swirled his brandy, and his smile had a knife folded inside it. Well now, Nathaniel, is this the quiet little wife you bought along with the Whitfield land? The laughter that came after was the soft kind, the agreeing kind. 6 men around a long table, the county recorder among them, all of them looking at her the way men look at a thing that has wandered in where it doesn't belong. Clara did not look at Pike. She looked at her husband, and she waited. There is one moment a wife will hold out to a man, even after she has stopped hoping for him, a single moment, in which he can be the thing he swore to be. She held it out to Nathaniel now in plain sight of every man at that table. Defend me. Say I am your wife. Say it once. Nathaniel Ashford set down his glass. For half a breath, something moved behind his eyes. Then his face shut like a ledger snapping closed. This is a private gathering, Clara. Cold, even, pitched for the room, not for her. You were not invited here. The recorder studied his own hands. Pike's grin spread wide and slow, and Clara, raised in a fine house before the money went, who had mended her own gloves, so the patches wouldn't show who had not cried the day strangers carried her mother's piano out the door. Clara did not cry now. She went still. That was the thing the men could not read because none of them had ever had to learn it. I see, she said. 2 words. She crossed to the small table by the door and set the portfolio down, smoothing the leather flap closed, slow and careful, the way a person leaves something for someone they trust to understand it. Then she turned and walked out. She did not slam the door. She drew it shut behind her, soft, a small click that somehow cut clean through all that laughing. Pike lifted his glass. Well, now perhaps we can talk business. The men returned to their brandy, but Nathaniel sat at the head of his own table and found he could not take his eyes off the closed door and could not have said why his chest had pulled tight. Because in the half-second before she'd turned, he had seen her face. He'd braced for a wounded one. A wounded wife. He could manage. A wounded wife wept or pleaded or sent a note in the morning begging pardon for shaming him. But what he'd seen on Clara was not a wound. It was a verdict. You're quiet tonight, Ashford. Pike found him on the gallery an hour later, the other men gone up to bed. Trouble with the little wife. Go to bed, Edmund. I only meant. I know what you meant. Nathaniel didn't turn. Go to bed. Pike chuckled and went. And Nathaniel stood there until the house had gone silent, then walked back through the hall and stopped because the portfolio was still sitting on the small table where she'd left it. He nearly left it for morning. Estate business kept till morning. Then some instinct he couldn't name made him carry it into his study. He read for a long time. It was the Western lots. 11 families he knew, half the names had ridden those fields as a boy at his father's stirrup. Eviction notices, every one of them drawn from a clerk's bad arithmetic. And beneath them, page after page in a hand, he'd seen 1,000 times and never once truly looked at. Rents reconciled, a drainage charge billed twice a widow's arrears that simply vanished the moment the columns were honestly added. His wife had found all of it. His wife had sat up 3 nights that candle under her door he'd walked past and thought nothing of, and saved 11 families from the road. And brought it to him. And he had told her she was not invited. Nathaniel set the pages down and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. He'd speak to her at breakfast. Not the other word, he was not a man who came to that word easily, but he'd speak to her. Let her see he had read it. He did not yet know that some debts the morning comes too late for. Gray light. Margaret Hale climbed the back stairs with a candle and stopped cold in the doorway of Clara's room. "Oh," she said low. "Oh, no." The bed was made. Not merely empty, made smoothed flat, the corners squared like a soldier's. The wardrobe stood open and near bare, and on the writing desk, weighted under a smooth river stone, a single sheet of paper. Margaret didn't read it. Not her place. But she knew the shape of a room a woman had left for good the way you know the shape of a chair that's lost its person, and she went down those stairs faster than her knees liked and pounded on the master's door. "Mr. Ashford, sir?" She did not wait to be told to enter. "You'd best come. Now." He came in his shirt sleeves. He stood in the doorway and looked at the made bed, the open wardrobe, the page beneath the stone, and Margaret watched a thing cross his face she hadn't seen since they'd buried his father. "When?" he said. "Sometime in the night, sir. I can't say closer than that. The mare's gone from the lower stable." "Did no one hear? Tom heard a horse near 3 o'clock. Margaret's voice was careful as a hand on a hot kettle. "He thought it one of your guests' men, sir. He'd no reason to think otherwise." Nathaniel crossed the room and lifted the stone from the page. He'd steeled himself for a letter recriminations grief, all the things a leaving woman writes. It was not that. It was his own hand. A copy made in Clara's careful script of a letter he'd sent Silas Green before the wedding. He remembered the chair he'd written it in, and he remembered the sentence she had underscored once with a straight, clean stroke. "She is a necessary asset to secure the Whitfield land. Nothing else. No word of her own. Just his own sentence handed back to him as if to say, 'You told me what I was. I have only written it down, so you cannot pretend you never said it, sir.'" Margaret had gone pale. "Shall I send a man to ride after her?" "No." It came out too fast, then quieter. "No. Not yet, Margaret." Because something colder than grief had started to rise in him. He left the room at a near-run candle guttering and went straight to the long drawer of the great desk in his study where the house kept its most important papers. The marriage settlement. Third from the top in the leather sleeve stamped with his father's seal. The sleeve was there. His fingers worked it open. There was nothing inside. Nathaniel Ashford stood holding an empty leather sleeve in the gray light, and for the first time in his grown life, he had no notion what came next. Silas Green was at the door by full light, and the man had never been seen to hurry in 20 years of service. He was hurrying now. "You've heard, then," Nathaniel said, his back to the room. "I've had a notice." Silas dropped a folded paper on the desk. "Delivered to my office at first light by a rider I didn't know. It comes from a representative acting on behalf of your wife." Nathaniel turned. "She's been gone 6 hours, and she has a representative. She's had one a good deal longer than 6 hours, I'd wager." Silas did not soften it. He'd known Nathaniel since the man wore short trousers, and he'd earned the right to talk straight. "Read it." Nathaniel read. The color drained from his face in slow degrees. "This is nonsense. She can't—" "Sit down, Nathaniel." "I'll not sit in my own—" "Sit." Silas hauled out a chair, and there was such iron in it that Nathaniel, who took orders from no living man, sat. The lawyer laid his hat on the desk and looked at his client with something that was neither pity nor respect, but had a little of both in it. "Now you'll hear all of it before you open your mouth," Silas said, "because the next thing you say in temper could cost you more than you can presently imagine. Are we clear?" Nathaniel's jaw worked. "Speak. That settlement joining the Whitfield land to your holdings, it was never a plain deed of transfer. You wanted plain. I told you it couldn't be done plain on account of entailments off the girl's grandmother that no husband's signature can undo. So I drew it as a settlement. A lawful partnership good only so long as the marriage was conducted as a marriage. Not a purchase, Nathaniel. A marriage. It is a marriage. She stands as proof she is my wife. Is she?" Silas let that hang. "There's a clause, the 4th article. I read it aloud to you. I read it aloud to her. You were minding your pocket watch. She was not." He leaned in. "The 4th article holds that should either party treat the union as a matter of property rather than partnership, Should either party publicly repudiate the other's standing as master or mistress of the joint household, the contingent transfer is void, and the Whitfield land reverts whole and clear to the surviving Whitfield heir. The clock on the mantel ticked into the silence. "You repudiated her standing as mistress of this household," Silas said quietly, "before the county recorder of this state. At your own table. In words a dozen men will swear to under oath. You were not invited here." Nathaniel did not answer. She read that contract before she set her name to it. Now there was something near awe under the lawyer's dry voice. "I've turned it over all the way here on the road." She read every line. She understood the fourth article better than you did, better, God help me, than I credited sitting there so still. I half forgot she was in the room. She knew. From the hour she signed, she knew the land would come back to her the very day you handled her as a thing you'd bought instead of a woman you'd wed. Then she stole the contract too. She did not steal it. Silas's voice cracked across him like a whip. She removed the one instrument that gave you any claim over what was always going to be hers, lawfully. There is a world of difference between those two things, and a court will know it even if you don't. Nathaniel rose. He walked away from the desk and stood with one hand braced against the cold stone of the mantel, his head bowed. "She didn't run from me," he said. Not a question a man saying aloud with effort, a thing he was only now able to grasp. "No." Silas agreed. "She did not. She judged me." The lawyer was quiet a moment. "I believe she did, and having read that contract 100 times and never once seen what she saw in it, I believe the verdict was sound." It came to Nathaniel then, all of it in a single cold wave. The music in the evenings, the library always set right, the accounts that always balanced to the penny, the tenant families who somehow never starved through the worst winters. He'd credited it to good servants. It had been her, every bit of it. Quiet, unasked, uncredited. She had handed him the proof of exactly who she was every single day for the better part of a year, and he'd looked straight through her because he'd decided in advance that she was plain and dull and useful, and a man will never see what he's already ruled, not worth the seeing. He'd been given one last moment at that table to be her husband, and he'd chosen in front of every man who mattered in the county to be nothing of the kind. What a court could give back was only the land. The land was the smallest part of it. "Silas." His voice had changed lower, stripped of its old certainty. "Nathaniel. Where is she?" The lawyer picked up his hat and turned it once in his hands. "I expect," he said, "that you already know." He knew. He had known before the lawyer finished the sentence. The Whitfield cottage on the far western edge, the one with the failing well that Clara had asked him to mend last autumn, and that he'd told her wasn't worth the lumber. He reached for his coat. Silas put a flat hand on the desk. "You'll not ride out there today. She is my wife. She is the plaintiff in a matter that can take half this estate off you, and if you turn up at her door in a temper, you'll hand her a witness who'll swear to it under oath." The lawyer's voice didn't rise, which was worse than if it had. "Use the head God gave you, Nathaniel. Ride out there now, and you go as the man who threw her from his table. You'll prove every word of her case before you've crossed the lower field." Nathaniel stood with the coat half off the hook. "Then what would you have me do? Sit here. I'd have you understand the size of the hole you're standing in." Silas drew the folded notice back toward himself and tapped it. "This says her representative will meet me Thursday in Richmond. That gives you 3 days. 3 days to remember every cruelty you've handed that woman in front of a witness, because she will have remembered them already and written them down and dated them. I have not been cruel to her." The lawyer looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "You've been worse than cruel. You've been blind. Cruelty at least requires a man to notice his wife is there." That landed somewhere under the ribs, and Nathaniel had no answer for it. He let the coat hang. By the second morning, the house began to tell its own story, and it told it loud. It started small the way these things do. The coffee came up burnt. A guest's bed had not been turned. Margaret stood in the breakfast room, wringing a cloth between her hands, while Nathaniel waited on a tray that did not come. "Where's my breakfast, Margaret?" "Cook's gone to pieces, sir." The housekeeper said it plain. "She can't find the marketing accounts. Mrs. Ashford kept them, kept all of it, sir, in a hand none of us can follow. Cooks stood in that larder an hour not knowing what's bought and what's owed, and the fishmonger's at the kitchen door wanting his money, and she can't tell him if he's been paid or not. Then pay him and be done. Pay him from what, sir? Margaret's chin came up. She'd served the family 30 years, and she'd buried 2 Ashfords, and she was not in this moment afraid of a third. I don't know what's in the household purse and what's promised against it. Nobody knows. She knew. She's the only one who ever knew, and you sent her out the door. The cloth twisted in her hands. I beg your pardon, sir, she added, not sounding as though she begged it at all. Nathaniel set down his cup. How long has she been keeping the marketing books? Since the first month she came. Margaret's voice softened, but it didn't gentle toward him. She never said a word of it to you because you never asked. She'd sit up past midnight at that desk with a single candle so the house would run smooth as glass come morning, and you'd come down and never once wonder how the eggs got bought. He had wondered nothing. That was the whole of it. He had moved through a life made frictionless by a woman's hands, and credited the smoothness to the natural order of things, as a man credits the warmth of a fire he never built. Send the fishmonger to Silas, he said at last, and Margaret find me whatever ledgers she kept that are still in the house. There's the trouble, sir. The housekeeper's face did something complicated. The household books are gone, same as the contract. She took the ones in her own hand and left the old ones the ones from before her, and the old ones don't balance. Haven't balanced in years. She'd been quietly carrying the difference, and none of us the wiser. Nathaniel sat very still. His wife had not merely run the house. She had been hiding in plain sight the fact that the house had been failing before she came propping it up with her own careful arithmetic, asking nothing, saying nothing, letting him believe himself the master of a thing that had been quietly drowning until she put her hands under it. And now her hands were gone. The knock at the front door came an hour later, and it was not a tradesman. It was old Amos Carter, hat already off and crushed against his chest, and behind him in the drive stood a clutch of men Nathaniel knew by face, if not always by name, tenants off the western lots, the 11 families worth of them, mud to the knee, come up the long road on foot. Mr. Ashford. Carter's voice shook, but he held his ground. We come about the eviction papers. There are no eviction papers, Amos. There was, sir. We seen 'em. Constable read 'em out a week past 11 of us off the land by the first frost for arrears we don't rightly owe. The old man's jaw worked. Then your missus come out to us. Walked the whole western road in the rain, sir, with a portfolio under her arm, and sat at my own table and showed us the figuring. Showed us where the count went wrong. Said she'd carry it to you herself and set it right. The men behind him murmured. And then, Carter said, we heard she's gone. Heard it off your own stable boy. So we come to ask you plain, sir man, are we off the land or ain't we? Because if she was the only soul in that house who'd stand for us, then God help us, we'd like to know it now, and not at the frost. Nathaniel looked at the 11 men in his drive. They had walked miles on the strength of a promise his wife had made them. A promise she'd kept right up to the moment he'd thrown her out for keeping it. You are not off the land, he said. Carter blinked. Sir. The arrears were miscounted. My wife found the error. The word my wife came out of him strangely. She was bringing me the corrected accounts the night she left. They're in my study. I read them last night. She was right, and the constable was wrong, and not one of you will lose a roof over a clerk's bad sum. You have my word on it. The murmur changed. Carter's eyes filled, and the old man turned his face away, ashamed of it. We're obliged, sir, he managed. We're surely obliged. Then, quieter with the bluntness of a man who had nothing left to lose by speaking, She's a good woman, Mr. Ashford. Best this land's seen since your mother. Whatever's come between you, I hope you know what you let walk out that door. He did know. That was the cruelty of it. He had been made to know it completely in the space of 2 days by every soul on the estate, but the one whose word would have mattered. He found Pike in the morning room, with his boots up, helping himself to the last of the good Madeira. There you are. Pike grinned. Dreadful business, the wife. Though I'll say it plain, Ashford, she was never the match for a man like you. Plain little creature, no people left to speak of. You'll be well shut of her. Find yourself a Tidewater girl with proper connections and— Get up, Edmund. Pike paused glass halfway to his lip. Beg pardon. Get up. You're leaving. My good man, the roads are— You called my wife a thing I bought. Nathaniel's voice was very quiet, and quiet from him was new and dangerous. You said it at my own table, and I sat there and let you, and then I made it worse with my own mouth. So I'll not have you in this house another hour pretending you did me a kindness. Pike's grin curdled. You're throwing me out over a— I'm throwing you out. The plainness of it seemed to surprise them both. Margaret will have your horse brought round. Don't write me, Edmund. Don't call. Whatever I was, when I'd keep a man like you for company, I'd as soon not be him anymore. Pike rose, mouth opening and closing, and found that there was nothing in his arsenal of sneers that answered to a man who had simply stopped caring what he thought. He left without the rest of the Madeira. It should have felt like something. It felt like nothing at all, like sweeping one shard of glass off a floor that was still covered in it. Silas came again at dusk, and this time he did not bother with greetings. It's worse than I told you. The lawyer dropped his bag and did not sit. I've found out who her representative is. Who? Your wife's grandmother had a cousin practiced law in Richmond. Dead these 10 years, but he trained a junior. That junior is now the sharpest settlement man in the state, and he has not lost a contested marriage case in 9 years, and he has been Clara Whitfield's man of business since the month before your wedding. Silas let that sink. Do you take my meaning? She did not flee and then find a lawyer in her panic. She engaged that lawyer before she ever spoke her vows. She walked into your house knowing exactly which clause would set her free and exactly whose hand would hold the door. Nathaniel sat down slowly. You're telling me she planned to leave me before she married me. I'm telling you she planned to be able to. The distinction came hard and precise. Some women marry hoping. That one married prepared. She gave you better than a year, Nathaniel, a year of music and balanced books and tenants kept off the road, and every day of it she carried the key to the door in her apron pocket, waiting to see whether you'd ever make her use it. Silas's voice dropped. And the night you stood up at your own table and told her she was not invited, you put the key in her hand yourself. The clock ticked. Somewhere below a door he didn't recognize opened and shut the house. Gone strange and sluggish, without the hand that had run it. Then the case is lost, Nathaniel said. The land is likely lost. That's not the same thing. Silas finally sat, and when he spoke again, it was not the lawyer talking, but the old man who had bounced him on a knee 30 years gone. Listen to me, son. A court can rule on the deed. It cannot rule on the woman. And I have known you since you were small enough to ride on my shoulders, and I am telling you that you have this once in your life, the chance to lose the thing that doesn't matter, in order to learn the thing that does, if you've the wit left to tell them apart. And if I haven't, then you'll fight her in Richmond, and you may even keep the land. Silas rose and took up his bag. And you'll spend the rest of your days the richest blind man in Virginia, with a house nobody can run, and a name folks spit after knowing every cold night of it, that there was a woman who'd have made it all mean something, and you took her for furniture. He went to the door, then stopped his hand on the frame. She's at the cottage by the Failing Well, the lawyer said, not turning round. The one you wouldn't fix. I'll deny I told you. Thursday you owe me an answer in Richmond, and I'd think hard between now and then on which Nathaniel Ashford means to give it. The door shut behind him. Nathaniel sat alone in the study that had gone quiet as a church, the empty leather sleeve still lying where he'd dropped it, and for a long while he did not move at all. Then he reached out and drew toward him the corrected accounts in his wife's careful hand, the 11 families, the doubled charge, the widow's arrears that came to nothing, and he read them again from the first page. Slowly, the way a man reads a letter from someone he is only now beginning to understand he loved. Outside, a horse stamped in the dark, and the long road west lay waiting. He rode through the night and came to the cottage at first light, and she did not come running. That was the first thing he saw. Not the Failing Well, not the bare little place he'd refused to fix, but Clara on her knees in a row of beans, with her sleeves shoved past the elbow and her hands black to the wrist in the dirt. And when his horse came up the track, she lifted her head, looked at him once, and went back to her work. Clara. You'll want to tie that horse where he can't get at the lettuces." She did not rise. "He'll have the whole row down in a minute, and I've not got rows to spare." He climbed down. He'd ridden all night rehearsing the things a man says, and not one of them would come now with her there in the dirt, looking more like herself than she ever had under his roof. I know why you came." She tamped soil around a seedling with 2 fingers, gentle the way she did everything. "Silas told you where I was. He'd no business doing it, and he knows it, and he did it anyway because he's fond of you, and he's a fool about it. You're 3 days from Richmond, and you've come to talk me out of court." She sat back on her heels and finally looked at him full. "Have I got the shape of it right?" "That's not—" He stopped. Partly. A small breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Well, that's more honest than I expected, so I'll give you a chair for it. There's one inside and a kettle. You'll have to mind the step. The man who owns this land never would fix it." She rose, brushing her hands against her apron, and went in ahead of him, and he followed, because there was nothing else to do. The cottage was 1 room and a loft. He took in a narrow bed, a table that had been scrubbed soft, a shelf of books he recognized from his own library. Her books. He corrected himself, the ones she'd brought to the marriage, and a single chair which she set out for him before lowering herself onto a milking stool by the cold hearth. "Sit," she said. "You look half dead. Did you sleep at all?" No, she agreed, as though this confirmed something. "You always did think a thing could be solved by going at it hard enough through the dark. Sit, Nathaniel." He sat. And for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence was a different creature than the one that had filled his house since she left. That one had been an absence, a hole shaped like her. This one was full. She was in it. "I read the accounts," he said. "The western lots. You were right. The constable was wrong. I told the families they'd keep their land." Something flickered across her face. Relief quickly mastered. "Good," she said quietly. "That's good. Amos Carter has 6 grandchildren under that roof. I worried for them." Then her eyes came back up, and the warmth went out of them, deliberate, like a hand drawing a curtain. "But you didn't ride all night to tell me you'd done a decent thing. You came to ask me to drop the suit. So ask it and let's be done." "I came to tell you I was wrong." "You were." The flatness of it stopped him. He'd expected he didn't know what he'd expected. Some softening. Some sign that the words, costly as they were for him, had moved her. "That's all," he said. "Just yes, I was. What would you have me say?" Clara folded her dirt-stained hands in her lap. "That it's all right. It isn't. That I forgive you. Perhaps I will someday for my own sake, because carrying it is heavier than setting it down. But not today, and not because you rode through the dark looking tragic. You want absolution before breakfast, Nathaniel. It doesn't come that cheap. Nothing ever has in my life. I should know better than most. Then tell me what it costs." He leaned forward. "Tell me and I'll pay it. The land, I'll sign the whole of the Whitfield property back to you, clear your name alone. No claim of mine on a foot of it. Today. This morning. I'll wake Silas and have the papers drawn before noon. Is that the price? Take it. It's yours." He'd thought it would land like a gift. She looked at him the way you'd look at a man who'd offered to return your own coat after wearing it through the winter. "There it is," she said softly. "There what is. You still think it's yours to give." Clara's voice didn't rise. It dropped, which was worse. "You sit in my cottage, and you offer to hand me my grandmother's land, as though it ever passed lawfully out of my hands. As though the great mercy of Nathaniel Ashford is what stands between Clara Whitfield and the poorhouse." She shook her head slowly. "You haven't understood a thing. You've only changed which face you wear while not understanding it. Before you thought you'd bought me. Now you think you can buy me back. It's the same coin turned over. That's not—" He pushed up out of the chair, and the old reflex came before he could stop it. The voice he used on stewards and tenants and men who forgot themselves. "I am trying to make this right, Clara, and you sit there and—" He heard it the instant it was out of his mouth. The command in it. The edge. She heard it too. She didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head and watched him hear himself, and let the silence do the rest, and he sat back down slowly, the heat draining out of his face into shame. "There," she said again, gentle as a verdict. You see, it's still in you. The first thing you reach for when a woman won't give you what you want is the voice that tells her she'd better. You'd a year to unlearn it. You never tried because it never cost you anything until now. I'm sorry. I believe you are. In this minute. She rose from the stool and set the kettle over the cold hearth out of habit, then seemed to remember there was no fire and left it there. The trouble, Nathaniel, is that I've watched sorry men in this minute my whole life. My father was sorry. God, he was sorry every night at the bottom of a glass. Sorry the morning he signed away the last of what was ours. Sorry right up until the day he died of it. Sorry never fed me. Sorry never kept the roof on. I learned young to stop wanting a man sorry and start watching his hands. She turned to face him. So I'll not be moved by your face. I'll watch your hands. And so far your hands have offered me a thing that was always mine and called it generosity, and reached for the steward's voice the moment I declined. That's what your hands have done in my house this morning. Tell me, why should I trust them with anything that matters? He had no answer. He sat with his hat between his knees. This man who owned half a county, and found he had been more thoroughly disarmed by a woman on a milking stool than by any man he'd faced across a table. Clara, his voice came out rough. When did it start? You all of it. Silas told me you'd a lawyer engaged before the wedding. He made it sound like you'd planned to leave me before you ever married me. For the first time, something in her went still in a way that wasn't strength. Is that what he thinks? She said. Is it true? She was quiet a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed lower and older somehow, as though she were reaching back past the marriage, past the cottage, into a thing she'd carried so long it had worn smooth. Sit there, she said, and I'll tell you something Silas doesn't know. Something I doubt even you know, though, by rights you should, seeing as your own blood did it. She drew the milking stool back and sat facing him square. Do you know how the Whitfields lost their money, Nathaniel? The real account of it, not the polite county version, where my poor father drank and gambled and ran us into the ground. I'd heard you'd heard. Everyone heard. That's the version that was let loose to be heard. Her hands had gone still in her lap. My father drank, that's true enough, but he didn't begin drinking until after the loan was called. We held our land free and clear when I was a girl, held it 3 generations. Then came a bad season, one bad season, and my father borrowed against the harvest to carry us through the way every planter in Virginia has done since there was a Virginia. A bridge loan, a year or 2 at most, and we'd have been whole again. Who held the note? Clara looked at him. Your father, she said. The words went into the small room and seemed to stay there hanging. Old Mr. Ashford held the Whitfield note, she said quietly. And when the second season came in poor as well as he knew it might, as any man with eyes on the weather knew it might, he did not extend us the way a neighbor extends a neighbor. He called it whole, at once, knowing my father couldn't pay, knowing it would break us. Her jaw tightened. And then when we were broken, when the land was about to go to public auction and fetch its true worth and pass clean out of his reach, he came to my father with a kindness, a way to keep the family name from the auction block, a marriage. His son to my daughter, and the Whitfield land folded quiet into Ashford Holdings as a settlement, no auction, no scandal, the debt forgiven on the day of the wedding. Nathaniel had gone very pale. You're saying my father engineered our ruin, he said slowly, to buy your family's land at the price of a wedding. I'm saying he didn't engineer it. Her voice was terribly even. He only watched it coming and stepped where it would fall. That's worse somehow. A man who plots a thing at least has to look you in the eye. Your father just waited patient as winter, and let the weather do his work, and then arrived with his son and his mercy at exactly the right hour. I was 12 when he first came to the house to look me over. 12, Nathaniel. He stood in my mother's parlor and looked at me the way a man looks at a heifer he means to have in a few seasons when she's grown, and he said to my father, I heard it through the door, he said, she'll do. Plain ones make the steadiest wives. Let her ripen. Clara, let me finish, since you asked. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't lower it. She just kept on relentless, and every word was a stone laid flat. So I grew up knowing the whole shape of it, knowing that the man who'd broken my father meant to have our land through me, and that when the time came, I'd be handed across like the last clause in a contract, which is in the end exactly what I was. By the time you came to court me, your father near his grave, and the thing he'd set in motion finally come due, I was 24, and I had no people left but a drunk father in his last year and a name that meant debt. And I looked at the bargain laid in front of me, and I saw it for what it was, and I did the only thing a woman in my place could do, which was, I read the contract. For the first time, something like a smile touched her mouth, and it was not a warm thing. Your father's lawyer drew it to bind me, but your father was dying and careless, and his lawyer was clever and proud and put in a clause he thought made it ironclad. The fourth article, the partnership clause, meant to make the thing look respectable, look like a true marriage, and not a purchase, so no Whitfield cousin could ever cry foul in court. He never imagined the plain little bride would read it twice, and see that the very clause meant to dress up the theft as a marriage was the one thing that could undo it if the man I married ever even once treated me as the purchase I knew myself to be. She spread her dirt-stained hands. So I married you, Nathaniel Ashford. I married the son of the man who broke my family. And I waited. Not hoping to leave Silas has that wrong. I waited to find out whether you were your father, whether you'd look at me the way he looked at a 12-year-old in a parlor like livestock to be ripened and used, or whether just possibly you might be a different kind of man, and I might have a true marriage out of a foul bargain and lay the whole bitter thing to rest. Her hands closed. I gave you a year to be different from him, and then you stood up at your table in front of the county, and you told me I was not invited in my own house. And I knew. Her voice did not break, but it went thin, like a wire pulled near to snapping. I knew you were his son after all. Not in the cruelty, you've not got his appetite for cruelty, I'll grant you. In the blindness, in the not seeing. He didn't see a girl in that parlor. He saw an asset ripening. You didn't see a wife at that table. You saw an interruption. Same blindness, same blood. And I was done waiting to be seen by men who'd inherited the not seeing along with the silver. The cottage was utterly silent. Outside, a bird went on about its business indifferent. Nathaniel sat with his father's whole life rearranging itself behind his eyes, every kindness reread as calculation, every comfortable inheritance suddenly stained at its root. The land he'd ridden as a boy at his father's stirrup, the smooth running of his fortune. All of it built he saw now on a season of bad weather and a patient old man who knew how to wait. I didn't know, he said. His voice was barely there. Clara, I swear before God I didn't know any of it. He told me, he said your father had gambled it away, that the marriage was a charity that we were doing, the Whitfields a kindness, taking the land off their hands and the daughter with it. I believed him. I never asked. I never once asked how the note came to us. I just took it. Took you. The way I've taken everything in my life that was handed to me. I know you didn't know. And for the first time her voice gentled, though it brought him no comfort. That's just it, Nathaniel. I don't think you knew. I never thought you knew. If I'd thought you a man who'd do such a thing knowing I'd never have married you, contract or no, there's not a clause in the world worth lying down beside a man like your father. She looked at him steadily. But not knowing is its own kind of sin in a man who's never had to know. You've gone through your whole life never asking how the good things came to you. You ate the bread and never asked whose field it grew in. That's not innocence. That's a comfortable man's refusal to look. And it cost my family everything, and it nearly cost 11 more families their roofs, and it cost me... She stopped. It cost you what? He said. It cost me a husband I might have loved. The words came out flat and final, and they were the cruelest thing she'd said because they weren't meant to wound. They were just true. There. I've said it. I'd have loved you, I think, if you'd ever once turned around and looked. I was ready to. I'd half talked myself into it that first winter, watching you with the tenant children at the Christmas feast, thinking perhaps there's a man in there worth the waiting. And then the spring came, and you stopped seeing me again, and the summer came, and you sat me below Edmund Pike at your own table, and I put the loving away, where I keep the rest of what I've had to do without. Nathaniel rose. He crossed the small room, 2 steps no more, and went down on one knee in front of her milking stool, which was a thing no Ashford had done before any Whitfield in the history of either family. "Then let me earn it," he said. "Not the land. I don't care about the land, Clara. You can have every foot of it and burn the deed for all I care. Let me earn the looking. Show me how a man learns to see, and I'll learn it. I'm not too old. I'm not too proud." I sat in that empty house for 2 days, and I learned more about who I am than in 35 years of being told I was the finest man in the county, and I did not like one thing I learned, and I want to be different. Tell me how. She looked down at him for a long moment, and something moved in her face. Grief maybe for the marriage that might have been, or the smallest unwilling tenderness for the man kneeling in her dirt. Then she shook her head. "You can't earn it on your knees in a borrowed cottage in a single morning," she said. "That's the old habit again, Nathaniel the Grand, gesture the thing done hard and fast in the dark. Earning isn't a gesture. It's 1,000 small mornings of doing the unglamorous thing when no one's watching and there's nothing in it for you. You don't know how to do that yet. You've never had to." She reached out, and for one breath he thought she might touch his face, but her hand went past it to take up her gardening trowel from the table. "And there's the matter of Richmond standing between us regardless of either of our hearts. So get up off my floor before you ruin those good trousers, and let me ask you the only question that matters this morning." He rose. "Thursday," she said. "Silas will stand up in a Richmond courtroom on your behalf, and my man will stand up on mine, and they will fight over the Whitfield land your father stole with a calendar and a calling in. And you can win it. I'll tell you plainly, you may well win it. Possession is a powerful thing, and judges are men, and men side with men who own things." She turned the trowel over in her dirt-black hand. "So, here's my question, and your answer to it is the only thing I'll weigh, not your sorry, not your kneeling, not your fine speeches. When your lawyer stands up on Thursday, what does he say? Clara? What does he say, Nathaniel?" Her eyes held his, and there was no softness left in them now, only the steady, terrible attention of a woman who had spent her whole life learning to watch a man's hands. "Does he fight to keep what your father stole? Or does he stand up before the court of this state and give it back?" She set the trowel down on the table between them and folded her hands and waited. "You've till Thursday," she said quietly. "Don't tell me now. Words are cheap and the night's been long, and you'd say anything to my face in this minute, and we'd both know it meant nothing. Go home. Sleep. Then do the thing or don't, and let the doing be your answer. That's all I'll take from you now. The doing." He stood in the doorway of the cottage with his hat in his hand. This man who had never in his life been told to leave a room and obey, and he found there was nothing left to say that would not be one more cheap word laid on a pile of them. "All right," he said, and he went out past the well. His father's son had refused to fix, and mounted his horse and turned its head toward Richmond, 3 days off, and the whole of his name and his blood and his future folded into a single question he did not yet know how he would answer. Behind him, Clara Whitfield knelt back down in her row of beans and put her hands in the dirt and did not watch him go. He did not go to Richmond. Not yet. He turned the horse's head that way out of the cottage yard because it was the only direction that wasn't backward, but a mile down the road he reined in, sat a long while in the saddle, thinking, and then turned for home instead. Because she'd said the doing, and Richmond was 3 days off, and a man who wanted to learn the unglamorous thing done when no one was watching had 3 days standing empty in front of him, and he meant to fill them. He came into Ashford Hall near noon gray with no sleep, and found Margaret in the breakfast room, scrubbing a pot that hadn't been scrubbed right because there was no one left who knew the way of the house. "Margaret." She didn't look up. "You found her then. Silas told you where I'd wager, and now you've come back looking like a man who's been told the truth about himself. I know that look. Your father wore it twice in his life that I saw. Margaret, sit down. I need to ask you things, and I need you to tell me the truth, even the parts you've held your tongue on these 30 years. That brought her head up. She set the pot down slow. "What things?" "How the Whitfield land came to us, the real account of it. My father and the note. Everything you saw or heard in this house when I was too young to know what I was looking at." The housekeeper's face changed, went careful, then sorrowful, then oddly relieved, the look of someone set down a weight they'd carried so long they'd stopped feeling it until the moment it lifted. "So she told you," Margaret said. "You knew." "I knew enough." She lowered herself onto the bench across from him. I was housemaid here when old Mr. Ashford held that note over the Whitfields like a hawk over a sick lamb. I carried the coffee in the day the Whitfield man came begging for an extension, white as his own shirt. And I heard your father tell him no through the door, kind as you please, the way a man says no when he wants a thing to fall so he can pick it up clean. Her mouth tightened. And I was here the day he came back from looking the girl over. Just a child she was. And he sat at that very table and told your mother. God rest her, she didn't like it either. He said the plain, steady ones made the best wives. And this one would do nicely, once she'd grown, and the land would come with her, and no one the wiser. I've carried that 14 years, Mr. Ashford. I've watched that girl walk into this house carrying it too, and the both of you never speaking of the rot underneath, and I held my peace because it wasn't mine to break. Nathaniel put his face in his hands. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That your dead father was a thief in a fine coat? You loved him. Margaret's voice was not unkind. And you weren't ready to hear it. A man's not ready till he's lost the thing that makes him ready. You weren't ready till she walked out that door, and now you are, and so here, we both sit. She reached across, and in a liberty she'd never once taken in 30 years, put her work-worn hand over his. What are you going to do, son? He lifted his head. First, he said, I'm going to learn how this house actually runs. You're going to teach me. Tonight the marketing accounts, the larder, the lot. And tomorrow you're going to walk me out to every tenant family on the western lots and tell me their names and their troubles and which children are hungry, all the things she knew and I never asked. And the day after I'm going to Richmond, and I think I'm going to do a thing my father would have called madness. And what's that? Give it all back, and tell the truth about how we got it. He said it quietly, and saying it made it real, and he watched Margaret's eyes fill. They'll talk, she warned. The whole county, the Ashford name. The Ashford name was bought with a man's bad harvest, and a child looked over like livestock. His voice didn't shake. It can stand a little talk. He learned the house that night, and it humbled him to the bone. He sat at the desk where Clara had sat with the single candle she'd used, and Margaret laid the books in front of him. The old ones, the failing ones, the ones that hadn't balanced in years, because the man who'd inherited them never looked. He saw the shape of the trouble Clara had quietly carried a house living beyond a fortune that wasn't what it pretended to be, propped up month after month by a woman's careful, invisible thrift. He saw where she'd gone without small economies in her own keeping, that she'd never charged to the house. A winter cloak not replaced a thing here, and a thing there, so that the tenants might be fed, and the table might be kept, and her husband might go on believing himself a wealthy man. She did this every night, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Every night you sat with your brandy and your Mr. Pike. Margaret said, she sat here with a candle. And she never once told you, because she'd long since learned you didn't want to know, and a woman stops offering what a man won't take. He worked till the candle guttered. He did not solve it all. A year of her wisdom couldn't be swallowed in a night, but he learned the size of his own ignorance, which Clara had told him was the only place a man like him could honestly begin. The next day, he walked the western lots, and Margaret walked beside him, and gave him names. He had ridden past these families his whole life. He'd never been inside their doors. Now he sat at Amos Carter's table, where Clara had sat with 6 grandchildren, peering round the doorframe, and he listened, which was a thing he had never been taught to do, and was clumsy at going quiet too late, and speaking too soon, but doing it trying. Your wife sat right where you're sitting, Carter said, watching him with the frank suspicion of a man who'd been disappointed by Gentry before. 3 weeks back. Walked the whole road in the rain to tell us she'd see us right, and she did. We heard you told the constable we'd keep the land. He paused. That was her work, though, sir. The figuring that saved us, not yours. I know it. Nathaniel didn't flinch from it. I'm only the man who finally read what she wrote, but I mean to do better than read Mr. Carter. There's a thing happening in Richmond tomorrow, and after it, if I've judged it right, the land you farm won't answer to me anymore. It'll answer to her, and you'll find her a fairer landlord than ever I was because she knows your names and your children's names, and I'm only just learning them." Carter studied him a long moment. "Folks said you threw her out, called her uninvited at your own table." "I did." "And now you mean to hand her your land in open court?" "I do." The old man sat back. "Well," he said slowly, "I've lived 60 years, and I never yet saw a rich man give away land on purpose. I don't rightly know what to make of you, Mr. Ashford. But I'll tell you this, if you do the thing you say, there's 11 families on this road will know it, and we don't forget. Not the bad turns, nor the good ones." He stood and put out a rough hand, and Nathaniel shook it. "Go on to Richmond, then, and do the thing. Talk's wind. We'll watch your hands. We'll watch your hands." The same words she'd used, as though the whole Western Road had learned to see by her teaching. Silas met him on the courthouse steps in Richmond the next morning, and the lawyer was not pleased. "You've not slept again." "I've been busy not sleeping. Silas, before we go in, I'm going to tell you what to say, and you're going to hate it, and you're going to do it anyway." "Nathaniel." "Don't fight her claim." The lawyer stopped dead. "I beg your pardon? Don't fight it. Concede the whole of it. The Whitfield land reverts to her, clear her name alone, and I make no claim, and mount no defense." Nathaniel held his old friend's stunned gaze. "And there's more. I want it entered in the record the truth. How my father came to hold the note. That he called it knowing it would break them. That the marriage was arranged to take the land at the price of a girl. All of it. On the record in open court where it can't be unsaid." Silas had gone pale. "Do you know what you're asking? You'll not just lose the land, you can survive losing the land. You'll lose your name. The instant that goes into the record, it's the property of every gossip and rival and creditor in this state. The Ashford reputation, 3 generations of it gone in an afternoon. Your father's memory dragged through every parlor in Virginia. And you with it, they'll say the son confessed the father's crime, and a confessed thief's son doesn't dine where he used to dine, doesn't borrow where he used to borrow." The lawyer gripped his arm. "Son, listen to me. She asked you to give back the land. She did not ask you to burn your own house down to do it. You can satisfy her with the deed alone. Why this? Because she said she'd watch my hands, not my words." Nathaniel's voice was steady and low. "And a man who gives back stolen land quietly, with no one the wiser how it was stolen, has only made a clean trade. He's bought himself a clear conscience at no cost. That's not earning anything, Silas. That's just one more comfortable man arranging things to suit himself." He shook his head. "If I'm to be different from my father, I have to do the one thing he'd never do. He hid how the land came to us. I'm going to say it out loud. Whatever it costs. That's the difference between us, or there isn't one." For a long moment, Silas Green only looked at him. Then the old lawyer's eyes did something they had not done in the 30 years Nathaniel had known him. They shone. "Your father," Silas said roughly, "was the cleverest man I ever served, and I was ashamed of him every day for 20 years, and never once had the courage to say so to his face." He cleared his throat hard. "You've got more spine than he had, boy, and less sense, and I find I'd rather serve the spine. God help us both. Come on. Let's go lose handsomely." She was in the courtroom. He saw her the moment he came through the doors, seated at the back in a plain gray dress, her hands folded, her face composed. Come to watch his hands the way she'd promised. And beside her, filling the back benches, a clutch of rough-dressed men he knew, Amos Carter, and the Western tenants who'd walked or ridden the long road to Richmond to see with their own eyes what the gentry meant to do. They had not come for him. They'd come for her. But they'd come to watch all the same. Her lawyer rose first, a lean, sharp Richmond man, who laid out her claim with the cool efficiency of someone who had not lost a case in 9 years and did not expect to lose this one. The breach of the 4th article. The public repudiation before the county recorder, who was present and would testify. The reversion of the Whitfield land. When he finished, the judge turned to Silas. Mr. Green, the defense. Silas rose slowly. He glanced once at Nathaniel. Nathaniel gave the smallest nod. Your Honor, Silas said, the defense offers no contest to the lady's claim. A murmur ran the room. Clara's lawyer's head came up sharply. Further. Silas went on, his voice carrying, "The defense wishes to enter into the record the manner in which the Whitfield property came into Ashford hands in the first instance, so that this court and this county may understand precisely what is being returned and why it is returned without contest." And he said it. All of it. The note, the bad seasons, the calling in that a neighbor would not have done, the arranged marriage as the final instrument of a long and patient theft. He laid the Ashford name open on the table of the court, like a man laying out his own father's bones, and the room went from murmur to silence to the particular electric hush of a crowd watching a great house dismantle itself in public. Through all of it, Nathaniel kept his eyes on Clara. He watched her composure hold, and then slowly fail. He watched the careful stillness she'd worn through everything, through the humiliation and the leaving, and the cottage finally cracked down the middle. Because she had braced herself, he understood for him to fight. She'd come to Richmond fully expecting to watch Nathaniel Ashford stand up and defend his land and his name and prove himself his father's son in the doing of it. And instead, she was watching him take a hammer to the one thing his father had built most carefully, the lie that made the Ashfords respectable, and break it to pieces in front of the whole county for no gain to himself at all. Her hand rose to her mouth. Her eyes, which had been dry through every cruelty he'd shown her, filled and spilled over. The judge, when Silas finished, was quiet a moment. Then he leaned forward. "Mr. Ashford, stand please." Nathaniel stood. "This court is unaccustomed," the judge said dryly, "to a defendant who arrives to lose. You understand that your counsel has just entered matter into the record that no man compelled you to enter matter that does you and your family considerable harm, and which I'd have had no power to draw out of you had you chosen silence. I'll ask you plainly for the record's sake. Do you make this confession freely? I do, your honor. And you understand its cost." "I'm learning too, sir. I expect I'll go on learning it the rest of my life." Nathaniel's voice was level. "But I'd rather pay it whole and standing up than carry the other thing quiet to my grave the way my father did. The land was never lawfully ours. I'd not keep it by pretending otherwise, and I'd not give it back by pretending otherwise either. The truth's the only honest coin left in this, your honor, and I mean to pay in it." The judge looked at him a long moment. Something in the old man's face shifted, not warmth exactly, but the grudging recognition one man gives another who has done a hard thing he didn't have to do. "The claim is uncontested, and the breach is plain," the judge said at last. "The Whitfield property reverts in full to Clara Whitfield, in her sole name, free of any Ashford claim this day." He set down his pen. "And let the record further show that the defendant offered the truth where he might have offered silence. I'll not pretend that men's what was done, but this court has seen a great many men lie to keep a thing, and damned few tell the truth to lose one, and I find I'll remember it." He rapped the bench once. "We're adjourned." It was done. In the space of a quarter hour, Nathaniel Ashford had given away the better part of his fortune and the whole of his family's good name, and he felt standing there in the emptying courtroom lighter than he had felt in the whole of his life. He did not go to her. That was the thing he'd learned or begun to learn. The old Nathaniel would have crossed the room in 3 strides, would have made the grand gesture, would have demanded in the warm flush of the moment that she see how he'd changed and reward him for it. But she'd told him earning wasn't a gesture, and he believed her now, and so he turned to gather his hat and go back to the house and the books and the tenants and the 1,000 small, unglamorous mornings, having done the thing and meaning to keep on doing it, whether she ever came round or not. He had almost reached the doors when her voice stopped him. "Nathaniel?" He turned. She stood a few feet off, her cheeks still wet, the tenants filing past her out into the street. And for the first time since the night at his table, she was looking at him without the curtain drawn across her eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "The land? I asked for the land. I never asked you to stand up in front of all of them and unmake your own father. You've ruined yourself. You know that. You'll not be received in half the houses you were welcome in a week ago." "I know it." "Then why?" "Because you said you'd watch my hands." He held her gaze. "And a quiet surrender was just my hands buying me a clean conscience cheap. You'd have seen through it in a day. You see through everything." The ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile touched his mouth. I didn't do it to win you, Clara. I want to say that plain because I'd not have you think it was one more thing done to get something. I did it because it was true, and I'd spent 35 years not looking at true things, and I was tired of the man that made me. Whatever you decide about me, I'd have done it. That's the whole of why. She stood very still, studying him, and he let her the way he'd never let anyone study him, standing open under her gaze, without reaching for the steward's voice, or the grand word, or any of the old armor. A long moment passed. "I'm staying in town tonight," she said at last, slowly, as though the words surprised her even as she said them. "At my cousin's house on Grace Street. There's a kettle, and I find I've a great many things I'd want to ask a man who'd do what you just did, if that man cared to call." Her chin lifted, and the old wariness was still there, but there was something new behind it now, something not yet hope, but no longer its opposite. "Not as my husband. I'll be plain about that so you don't mistake it. The court's unmade, most of what made you that, and I'll not pretend a quarter hour mends a year, but as a man who's earned the right to be heard. For an hour. Over tea, if you'd like to come." Nathaniel Ashford, who that morning had owned half a county and a spotless name, and lost the both of them before noon, stood in the doorway of the Richmond courthouse and found that the thing rising in his chest was larger than anything either of them had cost him. "I'd like to come," he said. "Then come at 6. And, Nathaniel?" She paused halfway to turning and looked back at him over her shoulder, and her wet eyes held the first faint, unwilling warmth he had seen in them in longer than he could name. "Don't bring me anything. No gifts, no papers, no grand thing wrapped in ribbon. I've had my fill of men who arrive with their hands full. Come with them empty. Come ready to listen. That'll be worth more to me than anything you could carry." And she turned and went out into the street, where the tenants of the Western Road waited to walk their lady home, and left him standing in the doorway with his hat in his empty hands. He came at 6 with his hands empty. It cost him more than he'd expected, walking up to her cousin's door on Grace Street with nothing in them, no flowers, no folded deed, no gift to do his talking for him. He'd spent his whole life arriving with his hands full, because full hands meant a man never had to stand in a doorway as only himself. Now he had only himself to offer, and he found he didn't know what that was worth, and he supposed that was rather the point. Clara opened the door. She'd changed out of the gray courtroom dress into a plain one, and her sleeves were pushed up the way they'd been in the garden, and she looked at his empty hands, and something eased in her face. "You listened," she said. "You told me to come empty. I came empty. Most men can't." She stepped back to let him in. "My father couldn't. He never once came home without something in his hands meant to make up for what was in his heart. A ribbon, a pretty word, a promise. The hands stay full, so the man never has to look at himself." She gestured him to a chair by the small hearth where a kettle did sit warming. "Sit, I'll pour, and then you'll do the hard thing. Which is nothing." She set a cup in front of him and took the seat across, folding her own hands in her lap. "You'll sit there, and you'll let me ask, and you'll answer plain and not perform, and you'll not fill a single silence with a fine speech. You're a man who fills silences, Nathaniel. I've watched you do it 100 times at that table. The moment a quiet came, you'd reach for a word to cover it. Tonight you'll let the quiets be. Can you do that?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know," he said, "but I'll try." "That," she said, "is the first true answer you've given me in a year." So they talked, or rather she asked, and he answered, and between the answers he let the silences sit, and it was the hardest and the most important thing he had ever made himself do. She asked him what he'd learned in the empty house, and he told her the books that wouldn't balance the economies she'd made in her own keeping the winter cloak she'd gone without, so the tenants could eat. He watched her go still when he named the cloak, because she'd never told a soul of it had hidden it, the way she hid all her small sacrifices, and to hear it spoken back to her by the husband who'd never noticed undid something in her she'd kept tightly bound. "How did you know about the cloak?" she said quietly. "Margaret. And the books once I learned to read them right. There's a whole year of you in those columns, Clara, written in the things that aren't there. The things you went without and never charged the house." He turned his cup in his hands. "I ate the bread and never asked whose field it grew in. You told me that at the cottage. I've been asking ever since. I don't much like the answers, but I'm asking." She was quiet a long while. The kettle ticked as it cooled. "You're different," she said at last. And she said it almost unwillingly, the way a person admits a thing they'd rather not have to revise their whole heart around. "I came to Richmond certain I'd watch you fight me. I'd have bet the land on it. I'd already braced for it, told myself it was for the best, that I'd see your true face and be free of the last of my own foolish hoping. And instead I watched you stand up and take your own name apart in front of the whole county." Her voice thinned. "Do you know what that did to me? You took away the thing I'd been holding on to, the certainty that you were his son. I needed you to be his son Nathaniel because then I could leave you clean, and you wouldn't let me. I didn't do it to take anything from you." "I know. That's what makes it unbearable." A short, wet laugh. "If you'd done it to win me back, I'd have had my excuse to harden. But you did it because it was true, and you'd have done it if I'd never spoken to you again. And now I'm sitting here with no excuse left, and a kettle gone cold, and I don't know what to do with you. You don't have to know tonight." "No," she agreed softly. "I suppose I don't." He left at 8 with his hands as empty as they'd come, and walked back to his lodging through the dark, and felt for the second time that day lighter than he had any right to. He came back the next week, and the week after. Not to the cottage at first, to the Whitfield land, which was hers, now free and clear, and which she'd moved back onto, taking up residence in the old house her family had lost, and the court had returned. He came not as a husband, and not as a suitor, but as a pair of hands, because she'd let slip that the spring planting was more than she and 2 hired men could manage, and he'd shown up at dawn the next morning in his oldest coat without being asked. "I didn't invite you," she said, finding him in the field. "I know. I came anyway. You can send me off if you like. It's your land. You've every right." He didn't stop working. "But you're short 2 men for the planting, and I've a strong back going to waste, and I'd rather spend it here than sit in Richmond being not received by people I no longer care to dine with. So I'll work the row, and you can decide by sundown whether to keep me on." She watched him a moment, the lord of half the county on his knees in her dirt doing the work no Ashford had ever done, and something tugged at the corner of her mouth that she didn't let become a smile. "The pay's nothing," she warned. "Dinner and the satisfaction of honest work, that's all." "That's more than I've earned in years." He worked the row. She kept him on. And so it went through the spring and into the long, bright summer. Nathaniel coming to the Whitfield land 3 days a week, working beside her, and the hired men learning the soil, and the drainage, and which fields wanted, what learning it from her, taking her correction, without the old flinch of pride. He learned that she knew the land better than any steward he'd ever paid. That she could read a field the way she read a contract, seeing the thing beneath the thing. He learned that the tenant families came to her with troubles they'd never have brought to him, and that she knew every child's name and every widow's circumstance, and that this knowing was not softness, but a kind of discipline, a daily choosing to see what most owners trained themselves not to. He learned slowly that her quietness had never been emptiness. It had been a held thing, a banked fire, the stillness of someone who had decided long ago that she would not spend herself cheaply on people who hadn't earned it. He'd mistaken that for dullness once. He saw now it was the opposite, a richness so carefully guarded he'd never been given the key. And he never once in all those weeks asked her to take him back. That was the discipline she'd set him, though she'd never said it aloud, and he'd understood it without being told. The asking would have been the old habit, the man arriving with his hands full, the demand dressed as devotion. So he did not ask. He came, and he worked, and he listened, and he let the silences be. And he left at sundown with his hands empty week after week, trusting nothing and earning everything. Then the letter came from Richmond, and the ground gave way beneath him. He read it in the Whitfield field, standing between 2 rows while Clara watched his face change from across the planting. Silas's hand. The Ashford creditors had moved. The public confession, the open admission that the family fortune had been built on a theft, had done exactly what Silas warned it would do. The notes the Ashfords had carried the credit that had floated 3 generations of comfort. All of it depended on a name that was now mud in every counting house in Virginia. The creditors wanted their money. All of it. At once. The way old Mr. Ashford had once called in a desperate man's harvest note, the wheel had come round, and now it was Nathaniel's own holdings called in whole, knowing he couldn't pay. "What is it?" Clara said, crossing the rows to him. "It's the Hall." His voice was strange in his own ears. "Ashford Hall. The creditors have called the notes. I can't meet them, not after the land reverted to you, not with the name gone. They'll take the hall, the house, the home farm, near everything that was left." He looked up at her, and to his own surprise he found he could almost laugh. "My father broke your family with a called note and a bad season. I've broken his with the truth. The wheels come all the way round Clara, inside of one summer." She did not gloat. He watched her half-braced for it. She'd have had every right, the woman his blood had ruined, now, watching that blood ruined in its turn. But there was no triumph in her face. There was something more complicated and harder to bear, a kind of grief on his behalf, which he had done nothing to deserve. "You'll lose your home," she said. "I'll lose a house. I lost the home the night I told my wife she wasn't welcome in it." He folded the letter. "Don't grieve it, Clara. I won't. A week ago I'd have called this the end of everything. Now I find I'm standing in a field I don't own, with dirt on my hands, and nothing to my name, and I'm all right. More than all right. For the first time in my life, nobody's handing me anything, and nobody's owed anything by me on account of who my father was, and I'm just a man with a strong back and a thing to make up for. That's not ruin. That's the freest I've ever stood." He tucked the letter away. "Now, we've half a row left before dinner. Are we working, or are we standing here mourning a pile of bricks I never deserved?" And he bent back to the planting. Clara Whitfield stood in her own field and watched the man who'd thrown her from his table take the loss of everything he'd ever owned and turn back to her dirt without a word of complaint. And something that had been frozen in her for 14 years, frozen since she was a girl of 12, looked over like livestock in her mother's parlor, finally quietly broke open. She didn't speak of it that day, but 3 mornings later, when he came to the field, she was not in it. "She's up at the house," the hired man told him. "Said to send you in when you came. Said it like it mattered." He found her at the long table in the Whitfield house, her grandmother's house, hers again, and there were papers in front of her, and an inkstand and a chair drawn up across from her own, as though she'd been expecting him. "Sit," she said. He sat. "I've drawn something up." She turned the top page toward him. "I want you to read it. All of it, mind every line the way I read yours. Don't sign anything in this house ever again without reading every line. That's the first lesson of this table, and you'll learn it if it kills you." He drew the page toward him and read. And as he read, his hands went still. It was a contract, a settlement. But where his fathers had bound a woman as an asset to secure land, this one did the opposite. It bound nothing, secured, nothing transferred, no acre, and no debt. It was a partnership plainly drawn between 2 parties, holding their property, each in their own separate right, joined in the working of it, and the sharing of it, but owned by neither over the other. The Whitfield land stayed Clara's sole and entire. Whatever Nathaniel built from nothing would be his. And the marriage it proposed for it did propose a marriage. He saw his breath catching at the 4th article where she'd written. It was named in her own clear hand. Not as a union of property, but as a union of persons, dissoluble the instant either treated the other as a thing owned, rather than a soul chosen. He looked up. "Clara, I'm not finished. Read the terms at the bottom, in my hand. Read them out loud so I know you've read them and not just looked." His voice was not steady. He read them aloud. "I will not be an asset." He stopped, swallowed, went on. "I will not be decoration. I will not be invisible. I will not be carried in silence while a man takes the credit for the smooth running of his house. And I will never again by any man in any room be told that I am not invited." The room was very quiet. "That's the contract," Clara said. Her composure was holding, but barely. He could see what it cost her. "Those are my terms, and they're not negotiable, and they're not pretty, and there's no romance in them. I've had my fill of romance. My father drowned us in romance. I want the plain thing written plain, a man who'll hold to those 4 lines on the days he's tired, and the days he's angry, and the days there's nothing in it for him, because that's the only kind of marriage I'll ever lie down inside of again." Her chin came up, and her eyes were bright and fierce, and frightened all at once. "You've got nothing now, Nathaniel. No land, no name, no house. By every measure the world keeps, I'd be a fool to take you. So understand what I'm doing. I'm not taking you because I need you. I held the whole of the cards the moment that court ruled, and we both know it. I'm taking you if I take you because I choose to. Freely. With my eyes open. The way no Whitfield woman has been let choose anything in 3 generations. And that's the only way it could ever be real." Nathaniel Ashford, who had nothing left in all the world, looked at the contract in his empty hands, and then at the woman across the table, who had once been handed to him like a closing clause, and now offered herself like a free woman choosing, and he found that his own composure 35 years in the building was gone entirely. "Why?" he managed. "After everything why would you? Because I watched your hands." Her voice broke at last, and she let it. "I told you I'd watch your hands and not your words, and I have all summer, and your hands have planted my fields and fed my tenants and given away your own fortune and never once reached for me, when reaching would have been easy. A man's hands don't lie, Nathaniel. Yours have been telling me the truth since Richmond, and I'm tired. God, I'm tired of not letting myself believe a true thing when it's right in front of me." She pushed the inkstand across the table toward him. "So, you've read every line. You know my terms. Sign it or don't. But if you sign it knowing it makes you nothing but my equal, not my owner, not my rescuer, not my better, my equal. A man who'll be told no in his own house and learn to hear it. Can you live as that?" He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking. He thought of his father who had bound a woman to a table to take her land. He thought of the girl of 12 looked over in a parlor. He thought of every cold morning of his life when he'd taken the bread and never asked whose field it grew in. And he set his name to the one contract in his family's history that asked him to own nothing and be owed nothing and earn every single day the right to stay. "I can live as that," he said. "I'd rather live as that than as anything I was." She took the page back and read his signature and pressed it dry. And then Clara Whitfield did a thing she had not done in the whole of the story. She reached across the table, past the contract, past all of it, and took his hand in both of her dirt-roughened ones and held it. "Then we're agreed," she said. They married again in the autumn, plainly in the Whitfield house, with Margaret weeping in the front row, and Silas Green standing as witness, and Amos Carter, and the whole of the Western Road crowded in at the back, the people she'd saved come to see their lady wed the man who'd finally learned to see her. There was no settlement read aloud over a girl's bowed head. There was only the contract they'd both signed hanging framed on the wall. Where a deed might have hung in another marriage, its 4 plain terms in Clara's clear hand for anyone to read. The creditors took Ashford Hall that same season as they'd said they would. Nathaniel signed it over without a backward look and moved his few belongings to the Whitfield land with no more ceremony than a hired man changing farms. The county talked the way Silas had promised it would. The grand Ashford name was finished, and the man who'd worn it lived now on his wife's land, working her fields, answering to her at her own table. He had never once been happier. 1 year on, Clara sat beside her husband at the long table in the Whitfield house, and the papers spread between them were not contracts or deeds or eviction notices. They were plans drawings for a schoolhouse to be built on the western lots where 11 families had nearly lost their roofs, so that Amos Carter's 6 grandchildren and every child on the road might learn their letters and their figures, and never when they grew be ruined by a clerk's bad arithmetic the way a Whitfield girl's family once had been. "The drainage on the lower field will pay for the lumber by spring," Clara said, running her finger down a column of her own neat figures. "If the rye comes in the way I think it will. And if it doesn't, then we wait a season and build it the year after." She didn't look up. "We've time, Nathaniel. That's the one thing we've got more of than we used to. Time in a house that isn't cold, and a table where the servants speak when they've a mind to, and the tenants knock at the front door instead of the back." Now she did look up, and the wariness that had lived in her eyes for 14 years was simply gone, worn away by 1,000 small mornings of a man doing the unglamorous thing when no one was watching. It's a good life. I didn't think I'd have one. I'd made my peace with going without. He reached across the plans and took her hand, those dirt-roughened, capable hands he'd once looked straight past, and turned it over in his own. Clara. His voice was low. I told you that night at the table that you weren't invited. I've spent 2 years trying to find the words to take it back, and I never could, because some things a man can't unsay. So I'll not try to unsay it. I'll say the true thing instead, and I'll say it plain the way you taught me. He held her gaze. You were never not invited. You were the invitation. You were the reason there was ever a home worth entering. I had a house full of fine men that night, and not one of them mattered, and I sent away the only soul under that roof who made it a home, and called her uninvited, and it took losing every last thing I owned to learn that you were the only thing I ever had that was worth the keeping. Her eyes filled, but she was smiling now, full and unguarded, a thing he'd waited 2 years to see. That's a fine speech, she said softly. And you know I don't trust fine speeches. I know. That's why I've spent a year saying it with my hands instead, and only just now trusted myself to say it out loud. He brought her hand to his lips. Believe the hands, Clara. The words are only catching up. Outside on the land that had come home to the family, it was stolen from the late light lay long over fields that 2 pairs of hands had planted together. And in the house that was no longer cold, a woman who had once been bought like a clause in a contract sat beside the man who had learned too late to keep his fortune, and just in time to keep his soul, the one lesson his father never grasped in a lifetime of grasping. A contract can hand a man a wife. It can never hand him a marriage. Only respect can do that, respect written not in ink, but in conduct, paid out in 1,000 ordinary mornings, earned and re-earned until the earning becomes a life. Nathaniel Ashford lost a fortune and a name, and a great cold house to learn it. And sitting there in the warm with Clara's hand in his, and a schoolhouse rising on land, made right at last he knew past all doubting that he had come away from the whole ruinous bargain, the richest man he had ever been.